Hello, Sarah of SEK Handmade here. Last time I talked to you about what the heck is gauge and why does it matter, and today I'm excited to share with you how to make the best gauge swatch possible. Friends, this is something that I did wrong for a long time and that I see a lot of people cutting corners on or unintentionally doing it wrong, and that will affect the information that your gauge swatch gives to you. If you're not making your swatch in the best way possible, the information that it gives you will be either incorrect or incomplete, and what a waste of time. So today we're going to get all the nitty-gritty about how to make the best gauge swatch possible. Here we go. All right, to start off swatching for gauge, you are going to grab the yarn that you've decided to use for the pattern. If you need help substituting yarn, I'm going to link in the description below my videos about substituting yarn. This can be a complicated topic, and so I've got lots of tips and tricks for you. But once you've chosen your yarn, you're going to take that yarn, and I always start with this hook size indicated in the pattern. This may not be where you land, but it's almost always a good place to start. Then you're going to find where the gauge is listed in the pattern. And it is important to pay close attention to how the gauge is listed. Remember, we talked last time in my other video about how if the gauge is listed in stitches and rows, that you're going to work your gauge swatch flat. And if it's listed in stitches and rounds, you need to work that gauge swatch in the round. Also, pay close attention to notice if by the gauge it denotes whether the swatch is blocked or unblocked. If you have any questions about this, I encourage you to email the designer. That's what we're here for, and you should never be afraid to ask a question like, I'm working this pattern, that's important. And under the gauge, it doesn't say whether the gauge swatch should be blocked or not. Should I block my gauge swatch? If you are timid about asking the designer and it's not listed in your pattern, I encourage you to treat your swatch how you're going to treat the final pattern. If you are making a sweater that you're going to lightly block your gauge swatch. If you're making a shawl with a bunch of lace and you're going to aggressively block it to open up the lace, aggressively block it. If you're making a hat and you have no intention of blocking it, don't block your gauge swatch. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make when they are gauge swatching is taking the numbers in the gauge listed on the pattern and making their swatch to that exact size and then measuring end to end. Let me tell you, friends, if you are doing this, you are doing yourself a disservice. You are not getting the most accurate information you could from your gauge swatch. You always want to gauge, or you always want to create your swatch larger than the numbers indicated by the gauge. That is just what fit inside, if you've got it, the gauge ruler. But having extra around the edges, both in stitches and rows, will help you get the most accurate measurements possible. So I always recommend when you're working flat that you add at least 4 stitches to the number of stitches indicated in the gauge. That's going to give you a little bit of a buffer when you go to measure, because you always get the most accurate measurements when you measure in the middle. And the same goes for rows. Give yourself some extra rows and measure in the middle of your swatch. Once you get going on a project, your gauge is going to be more likely to meet that middle portion of your gauge swatch than any of the ends. So that's really important. If you're called to work in the round, friends, I know It can seem daunting to add this many stitches, but especially if you're making something larger where fit or yardage is really important, doing a bigger gauge swatch can save you a lot of time in the end. So if you're working in the round, take the number of stitches listed in the gauge, add 8, and multiply it by 2. Here's why. You're going to add those extra stitches for the end, and then you need to multiply it by 2, because unless you're using some special techniques, which you can do, you need to work a tube of the gauge, and you can only measure it when it's laying flat. So you need that swatch to be nice and wide so that you can make sure you can, again, measure in the middle. I do, however, want to encourage you to trust your gut when it comes to gauge swatching. If you are a few rows in and you are like, this is enormous or teeny tiny, trust your gut. There's no need to work up an entire giant swatch if you know in your heart it's way too big or way too small. The only thing I would say is give it a few rows before you make that decision. Especially chains can be, and the first row or two can be very deceptive about size until you get into a rhythm with the stitches you're making. So give it a few rows. But if you've got like 5 rows and you're like, I have like 12 inches here, no need to keep going. Stop and start with a new hook size. Anybody who has tried to wrestle a swatch and a tape measure knows that the battle is not done at creating the swatch. Measuring it can be a challenge too. I really, really want to encourage you to measure your swatch on a hard and flat surface. I really, really prefer a table or a countertop or even a hard floor. It can be super tempting when you're all relaxed and laid in the couch for the night to just lay it down on the couch cushion and measure there. But because the couch cushion is flexible, it's going to allow your swatch to bend and move and stretch, and you're not going to get the most accurate measurement possible. So I encourage you to get up, go to a table, and if you have one, grab your gauge ruler. This is the easiest way to keep your swatch nice and flat and get the best and most accurate measurement possible. If you need to block your swatch, remember, block your swatch and allow it to fully dry before you measure it. Also, I do recommend, if you have pinned your swatch down while you were blocking it, unpin it, because sometimes yarn, depending on the fiber content, can kind of bounce back, and you don't want to accidentally get inaccurate information by having it artificially stretched by pins. You would be so sad. Your fit would not be the same. All right, now you have made an appropriately sized gauge swatch. You have blocked it or not, depending on what's called for, and you have measured it on a hard, flat surface with the best tools you have to get the most accurate count possible. Now, what if your swatch is not meeting gauge? This is something that even to this day, I need to pause and think about for a minute. Here's the deal. If you have too many stitches in your swatch, so if the pattern calls for 10 stitches and you have more, 12, 15, then you need to go up a hook size. This will cause each stitch to be bigger, which will make there be less stitches in your gauge swatch. The reverse is also true. If you measure and the pattern called for 10 stitches and you have 7, then you need to go down a hook size or 2. You can try, depending on how far off you are, because the smaller hook will make all of your stitches smaller and there will be more stitches in your next swatch. Thank you so much for joining me today. It is always my goal to help you grow confidently in your craft, and I hope that the information I shared today allows you to do that. I really encourage you to check out the description below. There are lots of great links to other videos like my yarn substitution video and more gauge videos. There's more to share. There is also a link to a blog post all about gauge, and in there you will find a place to sign up to receive a free gauge swatch information sheet. This is super helpful in reminding you of this information quickly as you gauge swatch each time, and has lots of places to write down all the information you need to keep it in one place as you're gauge swatching. I would love it that if you found this video helpful, if you would give it a like, if you would subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss my next gauge video, and subscribe to my newsletter in the description below. Thank you so much for joining me today, and happy crafting!